In 1864, when Union forces entered a remote plantation in the state of Georgia, they were confronted by a horrifying sight. Dozens of children imprisoned in a basement, all with strikingly similar faces, nearly identical heights, matching bone structures, eyes empty of surprise, and fears that seemed to have frozen inside them long ago. At first, the officers believed they were witnessing yet another example of the scattered brutality of war, another forgotten crime left behind by collapsing authority. But the longer they looked, the clearer it became that this scene was not the result of chaos or sudden collapse, but of order, an order so precise and so persistent that it could only have been enforced deliberately over many years. When one of the officers finally asked why none of the children had even attempted to escape, the answer he received stunned everyone present. It was later summarized this way: genetically, they belonged to the plantation owner. Legally, they were considered slaves. That single sentence did more than explain their obedience. It shattered the very meaning of family, ownership, and humanity. These children were not hostages, not orphans, not enemy captives. They were the outcome of a decision made long ago, quietly, methodically, and far from any witness. If this story inspired you, and you'd like to hear more stories like it, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. To understand how such a decision could ever be made, we have to go back to a time before war reached this land, when the thunder of cannons had not yet replaced the soft scratching of ledgers, the turning of pages, and the cold, deliberate conversations that decide fates without ever raising their voices. The story returns to the moment Catherine, a young, educated woman from a respected family, lost her husband and suddenly became the owner of a plantation that felt less like an inheritance and more like a sentence. Her husband had been an incompetent manager. What he left behind was not stability, but heavy debts, unfinished contracts, and land exhausted by years of relentless cotton farming. The soil no longer yielded what it once had. The tools were old and broken, and the enslaved population had dwindled to the point where even basic daily labor was difficult to sustain. Creditors arrived one after another, each demanding repayment, circling the plantation like vultures. Everything pointed toward collapse. Everyone around Catherine expected the same outcome they had seen many times before, that she would sell the land, disperse what remained of the workforce, and return in quiet disgrace to her father's home. But Catherine saw that path as erasure. To her, it was not just failure, it was being written out of history as a woman who could not hold what was placed in her hands. She refused to accept that ending. So instead of surrendering, she began to think. Night after night, by candlelight, she pored over financial records, listed decks, compared costs, and searched for anything that could still be controlled. More than anything else, she reread the laws again and again until she reached a principle that seemed simple on the surface, yet carried enormous consequences. A child's status followed that of the mother. The child of an enslaved woman was enslaved, regardless of who the father was. At first, this was just another grim reality of the system she lived in, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it transformed in Catherine's mind from a legal fact into a solution. If the plantation's greatest weakness was the lack of labor, and if purchasing new slaves was financially impossible, then the only remaining option was to produce labor. Not randomly, not carelessly, but deliberately, systematically, and under complete control. Catherine convinced herself that she could build a system in which every birth served the plantation's survival, a system that removed dependence on the slave market and made the estate self-sustaining. She made this decision without passion or cruelty, at least as she understood it. She made it with logic. In her calculations, people became numbers, years became projections, and children became future assets. She entered relationships with enslaved men and gave birth to children who, by law, were registered as slaves. Yet in practice, she treated them differently.
She separated them from others, raised them in the main house, fed them better food, dressed them cleanly, and even taught them to read and write, an act that was not only unusual but dangerous. She taught them that they were different, chosen, closer to her than anyone else. What she never allowed them to see was that this difference was simply another kind of cage, one without bars. At the same time, any pregnancy outside her control, any relationship that threatened the structure she was building, was met with pressure, punishment, or quiet removal. The system mattered more than individuals. Order mattered more than feeling. In her own mind, she was not a monster. She believed she was doing what others lacked the courage to do, making hard decisions in the name of survival. Years passed, and the system worked. The plantation became profitable again. The workforce expanded. Debts shrank. From the outside, everything looked like success. Neighbors spoke with admiration about Catherine's discipline and intelligence, never suspecting what sustained that order beneath the surface. Until the Civil War reached the region, until the old structures began to crack, and until the doors of that basement were finally opened. What the soldiers found that day was not chaos, but the finished product of a plan years in the making. Children who did not understand freedom, children who did not know family, children who only knew that they belonged somewhere they had never chosen. The real story begins years before that dark basement, at a time when the Civil War had not yet reached this part of Georgia, and the sound of cannons had not replaced the rustling of wind through cotton fields, on a cold morning when Catherine stands on the porch of a house that is now legally hers but feels nothing like a victory. From a distance, the plantation still carries traces of its former grandeur, columns that were once white, windows meant to symbolize wealth, yet up close, everything speaks of decay, cracked paint, warped wood, a roof leaking in several places, and the smell of dampness mixing with the scent of exhausted soil. Her husband is dead, and what he has left her is neither security nor a future, but accumulated debts, unfinished contracts, and a plantation drained by years of relentless cotton farming. A man remembered by others as kind and respectable, but known by Catherine as an incompetent manager, someone who gambled, borrowed recklessly, accumulated debt, and abandoned the plantation to chance until creditors began circling it like vultures. Now all eyes are on Catherine, and everyone expects her to do what society demands of a widow: sell the land, scatter the remaining enslaved people, and return in quiet humiliation to her father's house. But to Catherine, this path is not merely failure, it is erasure, removal from the world of decision-making, the transformation into a woman with no control over her own fate, something she refuses to accept. So instead of surrendering, she chooses silence and begins to think. During the day, she sits with lawyers, overseers, and creditors, listening carefully, asking measured questions, and speaking less than expected. But at night, when the house grows quiet and darkness settles in, she lights a candle and spends hours alone with the account books, writing out debts line by line, arranging costs, comparing losses and gains, until she gradually realizes that the plantation's true problem is not the soil or the weather, but dependence on purchasing labor, dependence on the slave market, dependence on prices that shift every year without warning, dependence on men who may be sold, escape, or die at any moment. And it is this dependence that keeps the plantation fragile and perpetually on the edge of collapse. She returns to the law books, not with a moral or human lens, but as one would examine a cold instrument, a map that might hide an escape route, reading clause by clause, sentence by sentence, until she reaches a line long treated as obvious that refuses to leave her mind. The law stating that a child's status follows that of the mother, that the child of an enslaved woman is enslaved regardless of who the father is. At first, this sentence is nothing more than a grim legal fact, but slowly, in Catherine's mind, it begins to change shape, transforming from a rule into an opportunity, from law into solution. If the plantation's problem is a lack of labor and purchasing new slaves is impossible, then why should labor not be created, not randomly or chaotically, but precisely, deliberately, and under complete control? Catherine begins to think in terms of years and generations, not people but capacities, not lives but outputs. In her mind, a plantation takes form that no longer depends on the market, a place where every worker is bound to the land from birth, a closed system that feeds itself, and the longer she contemplates it, the more logical it seems, even necessary. She looks at the people around her with a new gaze. Physical strength, health, silence, obedience, everything becomes data, traits that can be measured, recorded, and placed into a larger design. And throughout this process, Catherine does not see herself as cruel. In her own mind, she is a woman forced to do what others lack the courage to do, a decision made for survival, for preserving the land, for protecting the name and position she refuses to lose. She believes that if the plantation collapses, not only the property, but her very identity will be destroyed. And it is this belief that gradually erases moral boundaries. Doubts grow shorter, decisions colder, and the future she imagines becomes more real with each passing day, until the moment arrives when no path remains. And it is precisely here that Catherine transforms from an unwilling heir into the architect of a system that exists only on paper for now, but will soon enter real life, a system designed to make everything predictable, orderly, and controlled. And without fully realizing it herself, she steps onto a path that will determine not only the fate of the plantation, but the fate of human beings who have not yet even been born.
As the plan takes shape in Catherine's mind, a new phase begins, one that is no longer limited to thought and calculation, but moves into careful, deliberate execution. She knows that any hasty move could attract unwanted attention, and that even the smallest mistake might destroy the entire system before it is fully born. So everything must appear natural, silent, without shock, without any change visible from the outside. Her first step is to redefine the internal order of the plantation, not on official papers, but through everyday behavior. She shifts certain tasks, removes some individuals under the pretext of illness or weakness, and brings others into positions where access to them and control over them are easier. Small changes that to an outside observer would look like ordinary managerial decisions, but in reality, each movement is part of a much larger design. Catherine begins to look at people not as individuals, but as components of a mechanism. She carefully evaluates bodies, the strength of shoulders, endurance under heat, silence in response to orders, speed of learning, even the way someone looks when asking a question. Nothing is accidental, and no behavior goes unregistered in her mind. At night, the ledgers are opened again, but this time not only numbers appear on the pages, but signs, short, coded notes that if seen by anyone else would look like routine plantation management, simple marks next to names, short lines, symbols that only Catherine understands and that quietly determine the future path of each person. She knows that executing the system does not rely solely on law, but on human psychology, on fear, hope, and the desire to be close to power. So she begins creating small differences, slightly better food for some, lighter work for a select few, a kinder look, a brief pause before calling a name, a longer silence before answering, things that appear insignificant but create meaning in the human mind and build the feeling of being chosen. Gradually, the plantation divides into two invisible layers, those who are still only labor and those who believe they are seen, selected, closer. This division is not yet official, but it takes root in behavior, in posture, in glances, in the way people speak to one another. Catherine understands well that when people believe they are special, they ask fewer questions and obey more readily, sometimes even becoming guardians of the order themselves. During this time, she also redefines her own position. She is no longer merely the plantation owner, but the source of judgment, decision, and fate. She keeps her distance, neither too close nor too far, close enough to avoid provoking fear, and distant enough to remain unreachable, a calculated presence that brings both reassurance and anxiety.
At the same time, unwritten rules begin to form, rules that are never spoken, yet are felt by everyone. Who may speak and who must remain silent, who is seen and who disappears, which behavior is rewarded and which goes unanswered. The first signs of the system's success appear quickly. Work becomes smoother, conflicts decrease, greater order takes hold, and creditors, for the first time in a long while, receive answers that seem convincing. Catherine takes these signs as confirmation of her path, reasons to continue, reasons to believe her choice was correct. But at a deeper level, something else is forming as well. A habit, the habit of making decisions without explanation, the habit of viewing people as tools, the habit of removing inconvenient emotions. Catherine notices that she sleeps more easily at night, doubts have grown shorter, and the voice of inner resistance has weakened, as if her mind has adapted to this new order, and boundaries that once seemed impossible to cross have now faded. It is during this period that the first serious lines are crossed, not through open violence, but through silence, through neglect, through the gradual removal of those who do not match the rhythm of the system. Some are sent to distant areas, some are sold, and others simply vanish from the plantation's narrative without explanation or question, as if they never existed. Catherine knows well that the system can remain stable if it allows no exceptions, and so any sign of disobedience or unpredictable behavior is managed quickly and quietly. She tells herself these are not personal choices, but necessities, part of building a sustainable future, a future in which the plantation no longer depends on chance, but on a precise and controllable design. At the same time, small rumors begin to circulate, vague whispers about the plantation's strange order, about changes in behavior, about an unusual silence, but none are clear enough to become a real threat. Catherine has learned how to respond, how to smile, how to attribute everything to good management, hard work, and discipline, and society is ready to accept these explanations, because success is always the best cover. By the end of this stage, the system still has no name and is not yet fully visible, but its foundations are firmly set. The plantation is no longer what it once was, people no longer think as they once did, and Catherine herself is no longer the woman who once stood hesitantly on the porch. She now knows she can create order, exert control, and shape the future without anyone fully understanding the cost being paid. And this is only the beginning of the phase in which the idea no longer remains on paper, but gradually engraves itself into bodies, minds, and lives, as the plantation slowly becomes something whose true name no one yet knows.
As time passes and the new order becomes firmly established, Catherine enters a stage where merely controlling behavior and the plantation's structure is no longer sufficient. Now she must restrain something deeper, the future itself, not as a distant idea, but as a chain of births, bonds, and dependencies that, if not carefully directed, could tear the entire system apart from within. She understands clearly that the greatest threat to the order she has built is neither open rebellion nor outside interference, but uncontrolled human relationships, connections that form outside the plan, emotions that cross defined boundaries, and children born without calculation. So her focus shifts from the present toward what lies ahead, gradually locking onto bodies, timing, and consequences. Catherine begins regulating the rhythm of life on the plantation with greater precision. Sleep schedules, work hours, distances between people, physical contact, even glances, everything must be predictable, because unpredictability is the enemy of the system. She realizes that although outward order has been achieved, beneath it still flow desires, fears, and hopes that have not yet been subdued, and it is precisely here that another boundary is crossed, not through commands, but through direct intervention. Catherine is no longer merely an observer, but an active manipulator, deciding who may grow close to whom, which relationships are tolerated, and which bonds must be suffocated from the beginning. These decisions are never made openly, but carried out through reassignment, separation, or excuses such as illness or labor needs. The plantation gradually becomes like a chessboard, where pieces move not by their own will, but according to a design known only to one person. Catherine understands that true power lies not in punishment, but in shaping options. Because when a person can imagine only one possible path, coercion becomes unnecessary. It is during this period that the first planned births occur, without celebration, without excitement, without even prominent naming. Birth is no longer treated as a human event, but as a result, an output of the system, something to be recorded rather than felt. Catherine watches closely, measuring reactions, noting who asks questions, who remains silent, who grows too close, and who maintains distance. Every response becomes new data, and every piece of data shifts each individual's position within the system. At the same time, she carefully manages appearances. The plantation must still look ordinary from the outside, a hard-working woman who through discipline and order has revived a declining property. Nothing must appear excessive or deviant, because society tolerates only what it can place within familiar frames, and Catherine becomes a master of this performance, of smiles, simple explanations, and prepared answers. Yet internally, she advances a little further each day. Her decisions grow colder, and her emotional distance from others widens. She no longer thinks in terms of human consequences, but of the system's durability, whether order is maintained, whether outputs align with projections. During this time, subtle signs of tension begin to appear, not rebellion, but fatigue, longer silences, glances that are quickly averted. Catherine does not see these as weakness, but as a natural part of adaptation. She believes people will eventually adapt to any order as long as it remains consistent and relentless. And for this reason, she allows not even a moment of loosened control. Every change must come from above, not below. Every decision must be singular, not shared. The plantation now enters a phase where it is no longer merely a workplace, but a closed environment with its own internal logic, a place where values, relationships, and even time itself acquire new meanings. And Catherine herself is no longer the calculating woman worried about debts. She is now the guardian of an order that, though still unnamed, grows more real, heavier, and more inescapable by the day. What she does not yet fully see is that the more complete the system becomes, the more impossible escape will be, not only for others, but for herself as well. Because the future she has created is no longer just a plan on paper, but a living network that breathes, grows, and demands a cost that will soon be impossible to ignore. Yet at this stage, Catherine does not view this hidden cost as a threat, but as an unavoidable expense, something like the price of order itself. Each day she becomes more convinced that if control is released even for a moment, everything will collapse. So she accepts severity not as a choice, but as a duty. Through brief meetings and passing glances, through rapid decisions and calculated silences, she learns how to impose her will without raising her voice or making overt threats. The plantation slowly becomes a place where people anticipate what is desired before an order is given, and this predictability is exactly what Catherine seeks. Because when individuals begin correcting their own behavior, the system reaches a point where constant intervention is no longer required, a sign of maturity in the order, an order now embedded not only in schedules and assignments, but in minds. And as this order deepens, the plantation increasingly functions as a closed and independent world, a world with its own rules, gradually distancing itself from the outside without anyone realizing exactly when that invisible boundary was formed.
As the years pass and the network Catherine has built grows deeper, the plantation enters a stage in which not only behavior and relationships, but human identity itself is rewritten. Because Catherine comes to understand that lasting control is possible only when people do not merely obey, but accept the meaning of obedience and absorb it into their sense of self, she realizes that if people are given a story for their place, a story they can cling to and find meaning within, constant pressure is no longer necessary. So her new focus becomes the construction of narratives, simple, repetitive, and seemingly harmless narratives that slowly take root in the mind. The narrative of order, the narrative of merit, the narrative of difference.
She begins defining the plantation not as a workplace, but as a large family, a place where everyone has a role and where stepping outside that role threatens the stability of the whole. These narratives are not delivered through formal speeches, but through short phrases, daily repetition, glances, and small affirmations. Catherine understands that language, like a whip, can shape reality. Gradually, differences acquire new meaning. Proximity to the main house becomes a sign of trust, silence becomes maturity, obedience becomes understanding, and asking questions becomes immaturity. People begin comparing themselves to one another not for freedom, but for position, and this silent competition strengthens the order. Catherine observes these shifts carefully and adjusts the narratives wherever they fail to work. A sentence is changed, an emphasis removed, a reward added. She is no longer merely a manager of behavior, but an editor of minds. At the same time, children born within this order begin to grow, children with no memory of the outside world, no basis for comparison, who see reality only through the plantation. For them, order is not imposed, but natural. Catherine studies this generation closely and realizes the system has reached a point where it can reproduce itself. Children who from the beginning learn what is natural, what is forbidden, and what is not even imaginable. She values their education, but not an education for freedom, rather one for efficiency, order, and acceptance of position. Reading and writing only as needed, basic arithmetic for productivity, and above all, learning when to remain silent. These children gradually become calmer, more orderly, and more predictable than their elders, and Catherine interprets this as success. Yet at the same time, signs of fracture appear, not as rebellion, but as quiet questions, lingering glances, pauses slightly longer than normal. Catherine notices these signs and reacts quickly, sometimes by drawing closer, sometimes by creating distance, sometimes by adjusting the narrative. She knows the real danger is not shouting but questioning, and so questions must either be answered or rendered insignificant. At this stage, she is more alone than ever, because the more complete the system becomes, the greater her distance from others. There is no one left who can speak to her about doubt or even recognize it. She is surrounded by people who either obey or are managed, and this loneliness, once an unwanted cost, has become part of her identity. Catherine tells herself that leaders are always alone and that solitude is proof of a correct path. Yet in rare moments, when the plantation falls silent at night, a faint voice whispers in her mind, not in protest, but in reminder, reminding her that this order carries a cost that grows heavier each day. Still, she cannot retreat, because retreat would mean collapse, not only of the system, but of the image she has built of herself. So she moves forward, strengthening the narratives, refining the education, calculating distances more precisely, and the plantation slowly becomes a place where the past has faded, the future is defined, and the present exists only to be executed. And it is at this point that Catherine encounters a reality she can no longer call mere management, because what she has created is no longer just an economic or social order, but a small world with laws of its own, a world that breathes, grows, and will soon demand its final price from its creator. And this small world shows increasing signs of independence each day, visible in children who obey without instruction, in adults who correct themselves before being corrected, and in a silence that no longer signals fear, but internalized law. Catherine sees that the narratives now repeat themselves without her direct presence, words spoken by others, values enforced without her prompting, and this automation of order is both victory and a hidden warning, because a system capable of continuing without its creator is also one that may one day become indifferent to her. Yet Catherine dismisses this thought as the natural cost of success, believing that as long as the core narrative holds, as long as meanings remain unchanged, no real danger exists. But deep within this order, something slowly shifts. The distance between person and role narrows until the role replaces the person entirely, and the plantation approaches a point where individuals not only accept their place, but recognize themselves only within it. And this is precisely the moment when order passes beyond control and becomes destiny.
With new identities stabilized and the narratives fully internalized, Catherine enters a stage where she no longer needs much direct guidance, because the order now moves on its own. Yet this very automation brings with it a new danger. the danger of errors born from within the system rather than imposed from outside. Catherine realizes that when people learn to act before being told, they may also begin to decide before being permitted. And for an order built on predictability, this represents a hidden but serious threat. So her focus shifts from creating meaning to refining it. She must ensure that the narratives are not merely repeated, but repeated precisely, without alteration, without personal interpretation, without slippage. Catherine begins correcting details. Things that once seemed insignificant now become critical. The tone of sentences, the timing of words, even the order in which phrases are spoken. Because she understands that meaning often shifts at the margins rather than in the core. She holds shorter meetings now, not for teaching, but for alignment, to ensure everyone understands exactly what they are meant to understand, no more and no less. At the same time, signs of deviation begin to appear, not in open behavior, but in interpretation. Some individuals grow more rigid than Catherine herself. Others bend the narratives to serve their own interests, and this is what unsettles her. Because a system that begins producing its own moral logic is a system slipping beyond control. Catherine intervenes swiftly, without drama, without display, simply by recalibrating pathways. Some are quietly pushed to the margins, others drawn closer, not as rewards, but as instruments of correction. She knows that true power lies in subtle repositioning rather than sudden punishment. At this stage, the plantation appears calmer than ever. Work is executed with precision, voices are fewer, dissent is nearly non-existent. Yet this silence is not the silence of contentment, it is the silence of synchronization, minds aligned with an order that no longer requires explanation. Catherine sleeps later into the night, not from anxiety, but from vigilance, because she knows that systems which function smoothly are precisely the ones that demand the closest monitoring. She rereads reports not to find major errors, but to detect millimetric deviations, a pause that lingers too long, a glance that carries too much curiosity, a minor behavioral shift that if ignored today will become a question tomorrow. And questions always mark the beginning of collapse. Meanwhile, the younger generation takes on a more prominent role, faster, more obedient, less inclined to question. Yet Catherine realizes that this absence of questioning, if left unguided, can become dangerous, because a mind that does not ask questions may instead generate assumptions, and assumptions are enemies of order. So she simplifies narratives further, shortens answers, tightens frameworks until no room for speculation remains. The plantation now resembles a clock whose gears turn in perfect harmony, yet any clockmaker knows that a single flawed tooth can halt the entire mechanism. Catherine fixes her attention on these teeth, not with anger, but with focus. She no longer sees herself as the architect, but as the custodian, someone who must preserve the system daily in exactly its current state, neither better nor worse, because any change, even a positive one, can disrupt balance. In this phase, she speaks less and observes more, issues fewer commands, and makes more adjustments. Her presence becomes less visible, but her influence deeper. And this is what causes others to sense her authority even in her absence. The plantation has reached a point where order is neither imposed nor taught, but expected, and expectation is the strongest tool of control. Yet beneath this harmony, something remains restless, not a person, not a behavior, but the system itself, because any order that becomes too perfect loses flexibility. And Catherine, despite her precision and intelligence, has not yet realized that in trying to eliminate every error, she is creating a space where a single major failure could cause everything to collapse at once. For now, the plantation is calm, too calm, and this calmness is a sign that, if one knew how to read it, would reveal that the story is approaching a point where no small correction will be able to save it. And within this calm, further subtle signs emerge, such as the endless repetition of correct behavior without the need for reminders, or synchronized reactions that feel rehearsed in advance. Catherine observes how patterns replicate themselves and mistakes are neutralized before they occur. Yet she also understands that this constant self-correction carries a hidden cost, because it leaves no room for initiative, natural recovery, or creative adaptation. She attempts to inject limited flexibility by defining narrow, safe margins, but every injection of flexibility requires increased supervision, and every added layer of supervision adds weight to the system. On nights when rain falls softly on the roof, Catherine listens to the sounds and measures the differences between silences. A silence born of fear is not the same as a silence born of habit, and she strives to preserve the latter while erasing the former, because habit is more durable than fear. Even so, she senses that the more mature the system becomes, the more impossible any return to earlier states grows. And this irreversibility makes decisions heavier and corrections more delicate. The plantation is now more than a collection of rules, but a fragile balance of expectations that, if cracked at any point, will send ripples everywhere. And Catherine, as the guardian of this balance, comes closer each day to realizing that maintaining order demands as much energy and cost as creating it, a cost that sooner or later may be taken not from others, but from herself.
As the system moves beyond stabilization and enters a phase of maturity, Catherine encounters something for the first time that was neither recorded in ledgers nor anticipated in narratives: memory. Not as a recollection of the past, but as a living force capable of disrupting order. She realizes that no matter how carefully she has engineered the present and the future, the past still exists within bodies, glances, and silences, not openly, but like a faint trace that occasionally reveals itself without warning. These traces appear most clearly in the middle generation, those who lived before the order was fully formed and now remain suspended between two worlds, not old enough to be openly defiant and not new enough to be fully absorbed. Catherine considers this state dangerous because suspension always creates comparison, and comparison is the enemy of unconditional acceptance. So a new focus emerges, the gradual cleansing of memory. Not through physical erasure, but through redefinition. She begins altering the narrative of the past, not abruptly, but drop by drop. Certain things are no longer spoken, some details fade, some stories are no longer retold, and in their place, simpler, safer, more controllable narratives are repeated. The past slowly shifts from a collection of experiences into a collection of explanations, and explanations are always easier to tame than lived experience. Catherine understands that once memory becomes story, it can be edited. She does this carefully, without outright denial, without blatant lies, only through selection, choosing what is worth telling and what is not. At the same time, subtle signs of resistance appear, not as protest, but as small variations in retelling, slightly different versions of the same event, emphases that do not align, silences that last longer than usual. Catherine records these differences and intervenes quickly, not to suppress, but to standardize. She knows that truth itself is not dangerous, but multiple versions of truth are. So her goal becomes the elimination of many voices rather than the removal of content. The plantation now enters a stage in which the past, like the present and the future, must be orderly. Memories must fit within a frame, emotions must become predictable, and narratives must remain aligned. Catherine thinks to herself that if minds can be trained, then memories can be disciplined as well, and this thought crosses another boundary. She begins observing reactions to remembrance, who pauses when a name is mentioned, who averts their gaze, who agrees more quickly than normal, each reaction signaling something not yet controlled, each signal an invitation to intervene. At this stage, she speaks less to groups and more to individuals, brief,
calm, seemingly friendly conversations in which the direction of the narrative is subtly adjusted. A sentence disappears, an emphasis shifts, and the individual carries a revised version of the past without realizing it. Catherine knows well that when people repeat a new narrative often enough, they gradually accept it as reality, not through force, but through adaptation. The plantation slowly becomes a place where even memories are shared, not exactly identical, but close enough to prevent divergence. Yet at a deeper level, something resists, not a particular person, but the very concept of remembrance itself. Sudden moments that surface without permission, a smell, a sound, an image that disrupts order for an instant. Catherine notices these moments and for the first time feels that total control may be nothing more than an illusion. But she pushes the feeling aside because accepting it would mean accepting fracture, and fracture means a return to disorder. So she grows stricter, not in behavior, but in narrative. Lines become clearer, authorized versions more defined, and anything outside the frame is rendered insignificant or incorrect. The plantation is now not only a place of work, order, and identity, but a place of guided memory, where past, present, and future move along a single defined path, with Catherine standing at the center of it all, not as an official narrator, but as the final reference point. Yet the more she attempts to tame memory, the more she feels something slipping from her grasp, something invisible yet persistent. And this feeling casts for the first time a shadow of true fatigue over her mind, not physical exhaustion, but the weariness of holding together a world that could collapse from a single small crack. But still, neither she nor the plantation is ready to see that crack, and the story continues forward in a silence that is orderly yet dense.
As invisible pressures accumulate and silences grow dense in ways that no longer signify order alone, the plantation enters a stage in which the first real cracks appear, not in behavior, not in narrative, and not even in memory, but in trust. A trust that had been built slowly and deliberately over years and now begins to erode without any great incident, without rebellion or shouting. Catherine notices that people continue to perform the same tasks, repeat the same phrases, and follow the same rules, yet something in the quality of obedience has changed. Obedience that once came from belief now comes more from habit, and habit, while durable, is more fragile than belief, because belief can be justified, whereas habit merely continues until something interrupts it. This subtle shift reveals itself in glances, pauses, and reactions, not as defiance, but as distance, a distance between people and the meaning once assigned to them. Catherine considers this distance more dangerous than open resistance because distance is invisible but accumulative. So she decides to initiate a new phase, the reconstruction of trust, not through softness, but through greater cohesion. She believes that if the system is tightened again, if meanings are defined more firmly, the distance will disappear. Yet what she fails to see is that each new tightening reduces the air and makes breathing more difficult. The plantation now exists in a state where everything appears correct, yet nothing feels light. Decisions continue to be executed, but with an almost imperceptible slowness. Approvals are given, but with delay, and these delays function like minor tremors before an earthquake. Catherine attempts to contain these tremors by increasing her presence, but her presence no longer produces the same effect, not because her authority has diminished, but because authority that is always present becomes background, and when power becomes background, it ceases to inspire. At this time, a small incident occurs, not a major accident or an obvious crisis, but a minor error in the execution of an order, an error that had never occurred before. The order was correct, the narrative properly transmitted, yet the outcome differs slightly from what was expected. Catherine observes this difference and pauses for a moment, not out of anger, but out of surprise, because the mistake is neither the result of disobedience nor ignorance, but of interpretation, precise yet personal interpretation, the very thing she has spent years attempting to eliminate. This small error is not dangerous by itself, but it reveals something long concealed,
that minds remain active even in silence, and mental activity, if not fully directed, will find its own path. Catherine responds swiftly and deliberately. The correction is made, the order clarified, the framework tightened, yet the effect remains, not in behavior, but in awareness. Those who witness the correction sense something they had not sensed before, the possibility of error. And the possibility of error means the possibility of distance. The plantation gradually shifts into a condition in which people think less about meaning and more about avoiding mistakes. And this shift makes the order more fragile, because an order built on avoidance is fed by fear rather than acceptance. Catherine understands this, but sees no alternative but to move forward, because retreat at this point would mean opening every door that has been kept closed for years. She decides to manage this fragility by defining new standards, more precise, more measurable, more rigid, leaving no room for interpretation. Yet each new standard increases the distance between people and meaning and reduces them to mere executors. Meanwhile, the younger generation, raised within this order, responds differently. They adapt more quickly to the standards, but without understanding why. For them, correctness no longer means being right, but being safe. And this distinction, while efficient in the short term, will be dangerous in the long term, because safety without meaning collapses at the first threat. Catherine remains awake more nights than before, not to revise narratives or review reports, but to think about something she has no name for yet, a sense of slippage, that the order is no longer advancing the future, but merely preserving the present. And preserving the present without hope of a future consumes energy. The plantation still stands, but it no longer grows, it only maintains itself. And this stagnation signals that the story has entered a new phase, one in which even the most complete systems must confront a question that no narrative can erase. If everything is under control, where does this heaviness come from? And within this unspoken question, the first true crack forms, a crack not yet visible, but already quietly tracing the path toward collapse.
As the invisible crack becomes perceptible and a weight emerges that can no longer be attributed to fatigue or misunderstanding, the plantation enters a stage in which order still stands, but meaning lags behind it. Catherine realizes that the system continues to function, commands are executed, a motion that continues not because it believes in a destination, but because stopping it would be dangerous. This condition produces a new kind of fear in Catherine for the first time, not fear of rebellion or outside interference, but fear of stagnation, because stagnation means pressure accumulating without release, and pressure without an outlet will eventually force its own way through. She attempts to cure this stagnation by reviewing structures, but every revision feels more like patchwork than repair, because the problem no longer lies in the components, but in the whole, in the relationship that has been lost between people and the order imposed upon them. Catherine notices the signs not in disobedience, but in small indifferences, in lifeless execution, in looks that are neither defiant nor obedient, merely empty. This emptiness is more dangerous to her than any shout, because emptiness neither responds nor reacts, it simply remains. She tries to fill this void by injecting meaning, by returning to the original narratives, by once again emphasizing necessity. Yet narratives that were once alive now resemble formal reminders. They are spoken but not heard. At the same time, another shift occurs, one that Catherine initially interprets as success. People begin making correct decisions without reference, but this correctness no longer comes from shared understanding. It comes from calculation, from choosing the least risky option, the safest path, and this means that ethics has given way to algorithm. Catherine realizes that the system has reached a point where it can preserve itself, but can no longer justify itself, and this lack of need for justification is both strength and threat, because what requires no justification also requires no loyalty.
In brief meetings and fleeting glances, she attempts to awaken loyalty again, but loyalty is an emotion that cannot be commanded, it can only be experienced, and an experience that has been restrained for years is now difficult to revive. The plantation gradually enters a state in which everything proceeds correctly, yet nothing feels right. This hidden dissonance exhausts Catherine's mind, because she had grown accustomed to outcomes being accompanied by a sense of control, and now the outcomes exist, but the feeling of control does not. For the first time, she considers that perhaps total control is achieved only when it is no longer recognizable, and this thought is both comforting and terrifying, because if control cannot be seen, how can one be certain it still exists? At this stage, very subtle signs of a new convergence appear, not convergence with the official narrative, but convergence with one another. People begin coordinating horizontally, not to execute commands better, but to reduce friction, to make daily life easier. This horizontal alignment, functioning without a center, unsettles Catherine, because an order that works without a center is an order that pushes the center to the margins. She tries to interpret this convergence as system maturity, yet deep down she knows that maturity without dependence means readiness for separation. At night, when silence spreads across the plantation, Catherine reflects on the recent past, not as memory but as a map, and realizes that none of the previous stages were designed for this point, because everything had been built on the assumption that meaning would always move ahead of order. But now order has surged forward while meaning has fallen behind, and this gap is the fracture that turns a crack into collapse. Instead of retreating, she chooses once again to preempt, not through greater severity, but by changing the level of the game, by focusing on a near and tangible future, small projects, short-term goals, things that might restore a sense of movement. Yet these efforts resemble balancing on a slippery surface, because movement without destination only consumes energy. The plantation has not yet collapsed, but the signs are clear. The system has reached a stage where it must either discover a new meaning or fail under its own weight. Catherine senses this crossroads, but does not speak its name, because naming means acceptance, and acceptance means the beginning of the end. The story pauses here not for calm, but for a breath before a leap that can no longer be predicted, a leap that may save the order or break it entirely from within. And it is in this suspension that the future, for the first time, slips out of control.
As the future slips out of the circle of predictability and the suspension can no longer be dismissed as a passing phase, the plantation enters a condition in which time itself takes on a different quality. Days still follow one another, seasons change according to the calendar, and work continues on the surface with the same former order. Yet the sense of movement has been hollowed out from within, as if everything is rotating in a cycle with no destination. For the first time, Catherine realizes that she can no longer anticipate the future by observing patterns, because patterns no longer promise anything, they merely repeat. This repetition without promise preoccupies her mind, because everything she had built was based on the assumption that order opens a path forward, not that it endlessly extends the past. She attempts, through small signals, through minor changes in work rhythm, scheduling, and task sequence, to restore a sense of progression, but these changes resemble the shifting of shadows more than genuine movement. People adapt, but without emotional reaction, without questions, as if change and stability mean the same thing to them. And this orderly indifference frightens Catherine more than any act of defiance, because she understands that the system has reached a point where even disruption fails to awaken it. At this stage, signs of erosion appear within Catherine herself, not as sharp doubts, but as a deep fatigue that rest cannot cure. She realizes that she has become not only the guardian of order, but also its prisoner, because every new decision must align with all previous decisions, and this enforced coherence narrows the range of choice day by day. For the first time, Catherine considers that the system's greatest success, the elimination of chance, may be the very thing that has removed the possibility of rescue. Because chance, though dangerous, is the only place from which real change can begin.
Yet on the plantation, no space for chance remains. Everything is either permitted or erased, either predictable or irrelevant. This rigid binary has turned life into a mechanical process in which error is neither corrected nor learned from, only expelled. Catherine resists compensating for this condition by deepening control, because she knows that more control would only increase pressure. Yet other options remain unclear to her. She can neither abandon the order nor redefine it, because any redefinition would require confession, an admission that what she built was not complete, and such an admission would shake the foundations of her authority. At this moment, a new and unexpected sign appears, not from the collective, but from a single individual, a very small reaction, perhaps a slight delay, perhaps a different choice that still fits within the permitted framework, yet challenges its spirit. Catherine notices this reaction and, contrary to her own expectation, does not intervene immediately, not out of neglect, but out of curiosity. For the first time in years, she allows something slightly outside the pattern to remain, not as policy, but as experiment. This brief suspension produces an unexpected effect. It causes neither chaos nor collapse, but awakens attention. Gazes briefly diverge from their habitual paths, not to protest, but to observe. And this act of observation is precisely what had long been removed from the plantation. Catherine records this response and realizes that perhaps the problem is not the absence of meaning, but the absence of the possibility of experience. People have spent years merely executing rather than living, and continuous execution, even when flawless, eventually becomes empty. This discovery, though still vague, opens a new fracture in her mind, a fracture emerging not from without, but from within the order itself. She cautiously begins to reconsider whether control must always be complete, or whether a small measure of uncertainty might be not a threat, but a condition of survival. This thought is dangerous because it could call everything into question, yet at the same time, it is the only thought that still carries energy. The plantation remains standing, but for the first time in a long while, something resembling possibility can be felt in the air. A vague possibility, not necessarily liberation, but change. And this possibility, though still unnamed, gives the story a new direction, a story that is no longer solely about preserving order, but about confronting the question of whether an order that never allowed experience can relearn how to experience without collapsing. And Catherine stands at the center of this question, not with an answer, but with a doubt that, for the first time, instead of weakening her, keeps her mind alive.
With that vague possibility still lingering in the air, and a doubt that now keeps Catherine's mind alert rather than weakening it, the plantation enters a stage where danger no longer comes from outside or from visible cracks, but from the coexistence of two incompatible logics. The logic of absolute order that has been the pillar of everything for years, and the logic of limited experience that has newly and uninvitedly emerged. Catherine realizes that allowing even a small degree of uncertainty has activated something that had long been dormant. Not rebellion and not disobedience, but attention, a living, questioning attention that, once awakened, does not easily fall back asleep. She sees the signs of this awakening in details, in glances that linger a little longer, in hands that hesitate briefly before acting, in decisions that still remain within permitted boundaries, yet carry the scent of choice, a small but genuine choice. And it is precisely this small reality that puts strain on an order built upon the elimination of choice, because order can manage obedience, but not choice. Catherine tries to contain this tension not by returning to total severity, but through cautious guidance. She wants to limit experience to controlled segments, to place it along safe paths so that it neither descends into chaos nor allows a past she labored for years to bury, to resurface. Yet she soon realizes that experience, unlike order, tends to overflow. Once people taste choice, even in its smallest form, they no longer return to blind, unquestioning execution. The plantation now enters a dual condition, outwardly calm and orderly, yet inwardly restless and dynamic.
From the outside, the familiar image of flawless operation remains visible, but within, a new layer has formed that functions simultaneously with the old ones, and this simultaneity releases new energy while also generating friction. Catherine senses this friction not as crisis or explosion, but as a constant vibration that makes focus difficult and decisions heavier. She understands that she can no longer function merely as the guardian of order, because order is now confronted with something alive that demands response. At this stage, reactions among individuals become more varied, not as open conflict, but as differences in pace. Some respond to change more quickly, some more slowly, some with caution, and others with curiosity. These differences in speed pose a serious challenge to a system that had been built for years on perfect synchrony, because synchrony was the pillar of stability, and now that pillar has cracked. Catherine attempts to level these differences by defining new rhythms, but each new rhythm aligns only one segment while pushing another behind, and this subtle misalignment is something that cannot be resolved by command or rapid correction. The plantation gradually becomes a place where a single order still exists, but multiple simultaneous experiences coexist. Experiences that are not necessarily in conflict with one another, yet are no longer fully overlapping. Catherine realizes that control has changed form under these conditions. It no longer operates as a top-down command, but must flow between layers, and this kind of control requires more energy and tolerates more error. For the first time, she feels that order is no longer a closed structure, but a dynamic field in which every small movement can produce unforeseen consequences. This awareness is both frightening and awakening, because it brings fear of losing certainty and awakening to the possibility of change. At night, instead of reviewing reports, Catherine thinks about behavioral patterns that still have no name, movements that are neither violations nor pure obedience, but something in between. She realizes that for years she had tried to turn people into fixed points, yet humans are inherently fluid, and now this fluidity has found a way to surface, not by breaking walls, but by slipping through cracks. The plantation has not collapsed, and no outward sign of crisis is visible, but Catherine understands that the story has entered a phase that can no longer be sustained by maintaining order alone, because order by itself is no longer sufficient. She faces a new dilemma. Either she must accept this limited experience as part of the system and accept the risk of change, or suppress it again and preserve outward stability at the cost of suffocating something that has just come alive. This dilemma has not yet become a decision, but its mere existence is enough to disturb the former balance. Catherine stands at the center of this suspension, not with an answer, but with a new awareness that can no longer be ignored. The awareness that an order that never allowed experience must now, for the sake of survival, confront experience, even if that confrontation marks the beginning of a path whose ending is no longer within her control.
With Catherine standing at the center of that crossroads, an order being drawn to the threshold of experience, the plantation enters a phase in which not deciding becomes an active decision in itself, because prolonged suspension can be just as influential as open action. Catherine realizes she can no longer buy time by maintaining the status quo, because time is no longer neutral. Each passing day allows limited experience more room to take root, while absolute order retreats slightly without collapsing. This quiet retreat does not appear as failure, but as a shifting of boundaries that were once rigid now becoming flexible, and that flexibility is both opportunity and threat. Catherine knows that if she leaves this condition unattended, experience will carve its own path, not necessarily toward destruction, but certainly beyond full control, the very outcome she had spent years avoiding with relentless effort. She decides that before experience becomes an independent force, she must define its shape, not by eliminating it, but through deliberate guidance. A new plan forms in her mind, one in which experience is permitted as an exception rather than a rule, a limited, time-bound, reviewable exception. Catherine wants to give experience a frame, to make it measurable so it can once again be turned into data. But in doing so, she encounters the first contradiction, because an experience defined in advance ceases to be experience and becomes merely another form of execution.
Yet she proceeds, seeing no alternative. The plantation gradually enters an unspoken, experimental period. Subtle but meaningful changes emerge. Some decisions are delegated with slightly wider ranges of choice, some tasks allow limited interpretation, and some paths no longer have only a single correct answer. These changes seem minor on the surface, but beneath the skin of order their effects ripple outward. For the first time in a long while, people are forced to think, not only to avoid error, but to choose, and that choice, even when constrained, activates something that has long been dormant. The plantation responds not with chaos, but with increased variation in pace, in method, and in outcome. Catherine observes this diversity with both fascination and concern, because she sees that the system has not collapsed, but it is no longer uniform. Order still exists, but it is no longer monotonous. This controlled heterogeneity releases fresh energy while exacting a cost. Coordination becomes more difficult, predictability declines, and the need for moment-to-moment decisions increases. Catherine understands that opening even a small aperture multiplies responsibility, because every choice can become a pattern, and every pattern can alter the future's direction. At night, she wonders whether experience can be restrained without being destroyed, and whether an order built for years on the exclusion of experience can truly absorb it. Meanwhile, human responses gain depth. Some move forward cautiously, as if expecting the space to close again. Others touch the boundaries with curiosity, not to cross them, but to understand them. And this act of touching creates a new relationship with order, an order that is no longer just an obligation, but a surface upon which movement is possible. This shift places Catherine in a new duality. On one side, she sees signs of life. On the other, she senses the risk of fragmentation. Because as the system grows more complex, its management approaches the limits of individual capacity, and that proximity is fragile. For the first time, she considers her own limits not as weakness, but as reality, a reality long concealed behind the structure of order. The plantation is no longer merely a reflection of her will, but a field of intersecting actions that are still small, yet increasingly independent. Catherine realizes she can no longer see, hear, and correct everything at once, and this new inability leads her to consider creating a conscious distance, not for greater control, but for observation. She intervenes less and watches more, corrects less and tries to understand more. This shift in role is difficult for someone who has long functioned as the center of decision, yet it appears to be the only viable path. The plantation has reached a stage where order and experience must learn to coexist, or one will destroy the other. Catherine sees this coexistence not as reconciliation, but as an unstable suspension, one that could settle into a new balance or accelerate toward collapse. She knows the path ahead is no longer linear, filled instead with deviations, reversals, and choices whose consequences do not reveal themselves immediately. And this uncertainty forces her, for the first time in years, to think of the future not as something to be engineered, but as something to be confronted. The plantation still stands, order still breathes, but the story has entered a phase where no guarantees remain, except that what comes next will not simply be an extension of the past. And Catherine, in the midst of this transition, understands that the greatest test is neither preserving order nor abandoning it, but learning to live within a space that offers no definitive answers, a space where every step carries both danger and possibility. And this awareness, though heavy, is the only force capable of carrying the story forward.
With the unstable coexistence between order and experience taking hold, the plantation enters a phase in which the consequences of this suspension are no longer visible only in individual behaviors, but begin to settle into the overall structure of the place itself, as if the land, the paths, and even the walls are responding to this dual condition. Catherine feels that the plantation no longer responds to her commands as it once did, not in the sense of disobedience, but in the sense that a new distance has formed between command and execution, a distance in which interpretation, hesitation, and choice now exist. This distance is where experience breathes, and where order is forced to acknowledge its presence. She realizes she can no longer rely on simple indicators to assess the system's health, because order still stands, yet its quality has changed. Coordination remains, but not of the former kind. Instead, it is a fragile coordination built on unspoken agreements and momentary adjustments.
Catherine begins to notice patterns that did not exist before. Small groups aligning without direct instruction, divisions of labor forming organically rather than from above, and silences that no longer signify obedience but calculation. These phenomena are neither immediate threats nor signs of collapse, yet to Catherine their meaning is clear. The system has entered a stage in which centrality is slowly dispersing, not disappearing, but being distributed, and the distribution of power, even in limited form, is always irreversible. She attempts to guide this dispersion by redefining roles that appear designed for greater efficiency, but in truth are efforts to preserve direction. Yet every new role carries with it a small degree of independence, and these independences are like seeds falling into prepared soil. Catherine realizes the plantation is no longer merely a site where decisions are executed, but a place where new meanings are being produced, meanings that are not necessarily opposed to the official narrative, but are no longer fully nourished by it. At the same time, the psychological pressure that for years had been evenly distributed begins to shift. Some grow lighter, others heavier, and this new imbalance creates silent tensions, not in the form of protest, but in subtle withdrawals. Catherine observes these changes and for the first time considers that her greatest mistake may not have been excessive severity, but excessive uniformity. Because when uniformity cracks, its fractures run deeper. She tries to reduce these fissures by creating different paths aimed at the same goal, yet these efforts resemble the attempt to regulate a river that no longer has a single bed. The plantation gradually enters a state in which multiple logics operate simultaneously: the logic of order, the logic of experience, and the logic of survival. The third being something Catherine had paid less attention to, because survival does not think in terms of meaning or structure, only continuation. She realizes that many new behaviors arise neither from a desire for freedom nor from defiance, but from attempts to adapt to an uncertain condition. And this adaptation, though intelligent, is unpredictable. At night, Catherine wonders whether it is possible to build a system that preserves order while allowing adaptation, without one devouring the other. But the answers are no longer clear, because every new answer generates further questions. During this phase, she notices deeper signs of exhaustion within herself, not merely decision fatigue, but fatigue of meaning, as if each day now requires a new reason to continue, a reason that no longer comes from the past and has yet to stabilize in the future. The plantation continues to function, harvests are produced, outward order is maintained, yet Catherine feels the story is no longer about efficiency, but about direction. And direction is not something that can be issued as a command. For the first time, she considers that her own role may need to change, not from center to margin, but from architect to companion, a thought that had been unthinkable for years, but now emerges as both painful and necessary. Because a system that feeds on experience requires guidance, not merely guardianship. At this stage, the plantation becomes a mirror reflecting not only the behaviors of others, but Catherine's own limitations, and this reflection, though uncomfortable, is clear. She understands that the future is no longer something that can be fully designed, but something that must be entered into dialogue with, a dialogue that is risky, uncertain, and without guarantees, yet the only one capable of preventing stagnation or collapse. The story now enters a phase in which every movement is both an experiment and a commitment, and Catherine, with all her doubts and new awareness, realizes there is no path back, neither to the absolute order of the past nor to unbounded experience, only forward, into a gray zone where meaning must be rebuilt each day, even if that rebuilding carries her farther from what she once was.
As the plantation sinks into that gray zone that neither returns to the past nor promises a clear future, a phase begins in which the consequences of Catherine's changing role gradually become visible. She, who for years had functioned as the center of gravity for everything, now deliberately steps back. Not a full withdrawal, but a measured distance that increases the capacity to see more than the capacity to command. This distance initially brings a sense of calm because the burden of moment-to-moment decisions is reduced, but it soon becomes clear that calm is not always a sign of stability.
Catherine notices that as her direct presence fades, relationships among people begin to take on new forms, not as open rebellion or overt alliances, but as flexible networks built on small trusts, daily exchanges, and mutual understanding. These networks are informal and unnamed, yet they function, and this nameless functionality poses a deep challenge to an order that for years had relied on naming, defining, and recording everything. Catherine realizes that meaning now arises not only from above, but from within these horizontal relationships, meanings that are practical, temporary, and context-dependent, rather than large, universal meanings that can be absorbed into an official narrative. The plantation gradually comes to resemble an ecosystem in which order and experience are not in opposition, but in constant exchange. And this exchange, though alive, is unstable, because its balance is maintained not by law, but by sensitivity. The smallest change can disrupt it. Catherine feels this fragility and understands that her new role has not reduced responsibility, but made it more complex. Because now, instead of making direct decisions, she must create conditions. Instead of correcting, she must listen. And instead of eliminating error, she must allow for repair. These skills are unfamiliar to her and require a patience she has not practiced for years. At the same time, signs of hidden conflict begin to appear, not between individuals and order, but among the networks themselves. Differences in interests, interpretations, and priorities slowly surface, small disagreements that, while still manageable, remind her that experience without a shared framework can lead to fragmentation. Catherine feels the temptation to intervene again, to tighten boundaries and redefine direction through command, but the experience of recent months has taught her that any hasty return would carry a double cost, because the networks that have formed no longer collapse easily, they simply retreat into invisibility. She decides, instead of reclaiming control, to focus on creating a shared language, a language that is neither the old official narrative nor a rigid set of rules, but a flexible framework for dialogue. This language is still raw and is transmitted more through example, experience, and provisional agreements than through proclamations or orders. The plantation enters a period in which dialogue, even if limited and cautious, becomes a necessary tool. Brief, private, and sometimes unfinished conversations whose purpose is not to resolve issues completely, but to prevent misunderstandings from accumulating. Catherine realizes that dialogue, unlike command, does not produce immediate results, but it prevents tension from settling and hardening. This shift in approach is time-consuming and exhausting because it requires accepting ambiguity, an ambiguity that for years had been treated as the enemy of order. At this stage, the plantation appears more alive than ever, not in the sense of happiness or freedom, but in the sense of constant responsiveness. Every decision has repercussions, every change creates ripples, and nothing is entirely without effect. Catherine feels she can no longer hide behind structure because the structure itself is changing. She is forced to confront the human consequences of decisions, not only numerical or functional outcomes. This confrontation sometimes leads her to doubt and sometimes to anger, but most of all to a deep fatigue born of trying to maintain balance between opposing forces. The plantation continues to produce, and overall order has not collapsed, but the cost of sustaining this condition grows heavier each day, not only for Catherine but for everyone, because living in suspension demands energy. Yet within this very erosion, signs of maturity also emerge. Some learn to manage disagreement without rupture. Some learn to accept responsibility for choice, even when its consequences are uncertain. And these scattered learnings show that the plantation is no longer merely a site for executing order, but a field for practicing life under imperfect conditions. Catherine sees these signs and realizes that the future taking shape may be neither a return to total control nor unbounded release, but a new kind of order built on the capacity to endure ambiguity, an order in which meaning is neither given nor imposed, but constructed through action. This understanding, though still fragile and incomplete, for the first time in years reveals a horizon where moving forward is possible not through force or abandonment, but through continual learning. And Catherine, in the midst of this process, understands that the story has reached a point where there are no longer heroes or villains, only people moving through a web of choices, consequences, and unstable meanings.
and the future not as a fixed destination, but as a path that must be rebuilt each day, opens before them.
As outside forces draw closer and the system of slavery in the region begins to collapse, the plantation that had functioned for years like a flawless machine enters a phase that can no longer be sustained through management and narrative alone. The signs had been there for some time, but now external pressure forces what had always flowed in silence to become visible. The first inspections appear routine, reviewing documents, counting people, registering property, but something soon catches the officials' attention. Patterns that are too orderly, dates repeating at irregular yet precise intervals, children with no clear family names and no stories about their mothers, and above all, the resemblance of faces, a resemblance that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The deeper the investigation goes, the less the plantation looks like a private estate and the more it resembles a closed system, one that has operated without interruption for years. Children are brought out from spaces marked on maps as storage rooms or auxiliary quarters, children who show no fear of the soldiers but no curiosity either. Their behavior is neither that of the free nor of the openly enslaved. It is the behavior of those for whom the concept of choice has never entered life. When they are asked what relationship they have to the plantation owner, the answers differ in wording but not in meaning. Genetically, they belonged to the plantation owner. Legally, they were considered slaves. The sentence is recorded in the reports and later becomes the axis of the entire case because it provokes neither simple anger nor easy dismissal. No law has been broken. The paperwork is complete. The registrations are precise. Yet the result is something for which even the legal system has no prepared language. At this stage, Catherine does not hide anything, not out of confession, but out of certainty. Calmly, she explains the debts, the land on the brink of ruin, the law that pointed the way, and the system she built to keep the plantation alive. In her view, this was not an emotional decision or a moral deviation, but a solution that worked. And it is precisely this effectiveness that makes the situation more disturbing, because failure would have made judgment easier. A system that succeeds is always more dangerous. The children are gradually removed from the plantation. Some are sent to care facilities, some to distant relatives, others to places they cannot yet imagine. Reactions vary. Some are shocked. Some fall silent, some still wait for instructions. Adults who lived for years within this order suddenly face a void that neither freedom nor memory can fill. The plantation is emptied, not by fire, not by violence, but by files, records, and transfers. This quiet evacuation weighs heavier than any catastrophe because it reveals that everything could have been stopped years earlier if someone had chosen to see. Catherine is not recorded as a monster, nor as a victim, but as a case of a person who, within the boundaries of the law, built an order that silently eroded humanity. In her final encounter with the plantation, she feels neither victory nor defeat, only a belated understanding. A system that turns human beings into tools eventually hollows out even its creator. The plantation is closed, but its story remains, not as an exaggerated legend, but as a documented reality, a reality that shows how law, logic, and silence can work together to create something more frightening than outright lawlessness. The end of this story is not total destruction, but the persistence of a question no official report can close. If everything proceeds correctly, legally, and logically, yet the outcome is inhuman, where does responsibility lie? With the individual, with the system, or with all those who chose not to ask questions? And it is this question that keeps the story alive long after the plantation gates have been shut. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel now, like the video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.